Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thank you for joining us, whether that's on Zoom or live on Facebook. And thank you for being part of this campaign. Um, yeah, let's continue onwards. I wanted to give a short shiur this morning on the question of David HaMelech, and David HaMelech specifically in the context of building the Beit HaMikdash. We know, or I think it's fairly famous, that David HaMelech was prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. The question is why that was the case, and what exactly was the issue with David HaMelech being in charge of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. So that's something we are going to explore this morning somewhat briefly, and really come to, I hope, a better understanding of exactly why it was that David HaMelech was prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. I think it's a great example, again, a great example of us being able to really learn Tanakh properly and look at the Psukim really in depth to be able to really ascertain exactly what the issue was. Because I think sometimes we have an understanding that has emerged over many years, many centuries. And when we read Tanakh properly and we read it again with a fresh perspective and fresh eyes, we realize that not everything is as it seems. So that's something that we're going to explore now. And we're going to see if we can come up with a real understanding of exactly what the issue was with David HaMelech as to why he was able or why he was prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. So we will start as follows. I'm going to share my screen and we'll see some sources together. Okay, so let's zoom in here and we can explore these things together. Okay, so we have as follows, and I think this is maybe where the most famous idea comes from in terms of the issue with David HaMelech building the Beit HaMikdash. Divrei HaYamim, Divrei HaYamim Aleph, Perek Chaf Bet. And the pasuk says as follows: Vayikra l'Shlomo beno, vayitzavehu livnot beit laHashem Elokei Yisrael. So David HaMelech is getting towards the end of his days, and he calls his son Shlomo HaMelech and instructs him that he must build the Beit HaMikdash. And he says as follows: Vayomer David l'Shlomo. I was prepared to go and build the Beit HaMikdash. But Hashem came to me and said, or the word of Hashem came to me and said, the word of Hashem came to me and said as follows, which is, you've shed much blood, you've fought many battles, you cannot build this house for me, because you've shed much blood on the earth. But what? Hinei ven nolad lach, hu yeh ish menucha, v'anuchuti lo mikol oivav misaviv, ki Shlomo yeh shomo, v'shalom v'sheket eten al Yisrael b'yamav. But you'll have a son. Your son will be Shlomo HaMelech, or known as Shlomo, I guess, at that stage. And he will have peace all around him. There'll be quiet in his time. There won't be any wars fought by Bnei Israel. And he's the one who's going to be in charge of building this Beit HaMikdash. Hu yivneh bayit lishmi, v'hu yeh li leven, v'ani lo le'av, v'hichinoti kisei machuto al Yisrael ad olam. And I'll establish his kingdom forever, and he will be the one who is going to be in charge of the building project of the Beit HaMikdash. So this is, I think, the famous pasuk that tells us that David couldn't build the Beit HaMikdash because he had blood on his hands. You were a man of war and you spilt much blood. And this actually is reinforced in the next source, slightly late in Divrei HaYamim, just a few prakim later, when if David was instructing his son Shlomo privately, he's now gathering all the Jewish people together just before he dies. And he's saying something to all the Jewish people. And he says a similar type of thing. He gathers them all together and he says as follows: "Vayikam David HaMelech al raglav vayomer shemauni achai ani im levavi livnot beit menucha la'aron brit Hashem v'adom ragli Elokeinu v'achinoti livnot." I was prepared and ready to build this place for the Aron, this permanent home for the Aron, the Beit HaMikdash, and yet I wasn't allowed to. Why not? ואלוקים אמר לי, לא תבנה בית לשמי, כי איש מלחמות אתה ודמים שפכת. Again, the same idea. You're a man of war, and you've spilled much blood, and therefore you cannot build the Beit HaMikdash. And later on we see, ויאמר לי, שלמה בנך הוא יבנה ביתי וחצרותיי, כי בחרתי בו לי לבן, ואני אהיה לו לאב. Actually, I've chosen somebody else in your family, Shlomo HaMelech. He's going to be in charge of building the Beit HaMikdash for you, but you won't be able to. Why? Again, this idea of that you've spilled blood, v'damim shafachta, and also ki ish milchamot ata, because you are this man of war. Now, at this stage, the instruction seems to be pretty clear. Hashem has told David, or David is telling us, that actually he can't build the Beit HaMikdash because he's somewhat defective in terms of what he's able, in terms of his maybe personality, in terms of the particular point in Jewish history where he finds himself. He's not able to build his Beit for Hashem, but his son is. What's fascinating, though, is that if we look carefully at the original time when David wants to actually build the Beit for Hashem, and he asks about building it, this is not the answer that he's given. If we look at Shmuel Bet, Perek Zayin, we see as follows. Vayomer HaMelech el Natan HaNavi, Re'ena anochi yoshev bebeit arazim, va'aron Elokim yoshev b'toch hariyah. I'm sat here in a beautiful palace in Yerushalayim. I've reached a point in time when I've got safety around me. I've finished battling at the moment, and I have this beautiful palace, a beautiful home that I can live in. But where is the Aron Elokim? Sitting in a tent. It's sitting just not particularly in a mechubad place, in a respectful place. It's just sat there in a tent. Vayomer Natan el HaMelech. He doesn't say anything. Now, David doesn't say anything. He doesn't say what he wants to do, but it's clear that Natan the Navi understands from this one pasuk of David that David has got a purpose in mind. What does he want to do? He wants to build a permanent home for Hashem, just like he himself has now got a permanent home in Yerushalayim. Vayomer Natan el HaMelech, kol asher bilvacha lech aseh ki Hashem imach. Natan says to David, whatever you want to do, go and do, because Hashem will be with you. Seemingly on the surface, Natan actually gives David the instruction and the permission to go and build the Beit HaMikdash. Go and build it. But then the problem is that the same night, Natan gets a nevuah in a dream, and his nevuah in the dream is from Hashem, and Hashem says to Natan, not so fast. And he says as follows, if we look further down the Hebrew, Hashem, what, you're going to be the one who builds it? You're not going to be the one that builds it. And if you carry on down, you can read in English. We don't necessarily have time right now to look at the English together, but if we look at the English, we can see that very clearly that Hashem says, actually, even though you, Natan, as the Navi, said to David, there's no problem, go and build the Beit HaMikdash, the Chavod, actually, not so fast. And at the end, we see in bold that Hashem says to Natan, deliver this message to David. You're going to die, you're going to dwell with your fathers. I will establish your zara after you. He will continue and he will establish his own kingship. He's going to build the bait for me, not you. Even though Natan said you can do it, he will build the bait for me. And his kingship will be forever. He will establish this dynasty of kings that will last forever. I will be a father for him. He will be a son for me, just like we saw in Divrei Hayamim. Okay, and therefore Natan tells David, I know I told you yesterday that you could build the Beit HaMikdash, but actually you can't. It has to be your son who builds the Beit HaMikdash. But what's very interesting here is there's no mention here whatsoever of David being a man of war, shafachta damim. There's no mention of this whatsoever. No mention at all. The only mention is that it's going to be your son who comes after you, who's going to be in charge of building the Beit HaMikdash. So on the surface, at least, it seems as though we have a stira, a contradiction between Shmuel, where the instruction comes from Natan that David is not to build the Beit HaMikdash, but nothing to do with the fact that he's a man of war, just that it's not for him to build. And Divrei Hayamim, where David relates to both his son Shlomo and the people as a whole, the wider people in his final instructions, that actually he can't build the Beit HaMikdash because he was told
damim shafachta, and hu ish milchama. He's a man of war, and he spilt much blood. So we have a quandary here. What was the actual reason? What was the reason that David couldn't build the Beit HaMikdash? Was it the reason given in Shmuel, or was it the reason given in Divrei Hayamim? And this is where I think, again, we have to read Tanakh very, very, very carefully to really ascertain what the answer could be. And we can start by saying is this, and I think we can answer these questions to ourselves. How many reasons appear here, and who exactly says what? I think if we look carefully, we'll see something interesting, which is when David is speaking to his son Shlomo, or when he's speaking to the wider Jewish people in Divrei Hayamim, what does he say? Let's go back and have a look clearly at what exactly he says. He says, Hashem came to me and told me, Shafachta damim larov shafachta u'milchamot gedolot asita. Or, Ve'elokim amali lo tivnei bayit lishmi ki ish milchamot ata v'damim shafachta. David is relating something that he's heard from Hashem. In Shmuel, though, this is Hashem specifically telling Natan the Navi what the reasons are as to why David can't build the Beit HaMikdash. So there's a slight nuance here. That in Sefer Divrei Hayamim, we have David himself saying, this is what I heard. Whereas in Shmuel, we have the direct word of Hashem telling the Navi what to go and tell to David. So if we now look at the different Mefarshim, they pick up on these nuances to give us a little bit more guidance as to exactly what's going on. Says the Radak in Divrei Hayamim, in reason 1. And we saw that there's this issue between Shmuel and Divrei Hayamim. Says the Radak, in his first explanation, the reason that David relates to the Jewish people or to his son, number 1, Zelo matzanu she'amar lo Hashem. We don't find anywhere in Tanakh that was the reason that was given to David. We don't find that. We don't find it in Shmuel. There's nowhere in Tanakh that relates that that's the message that David got. This is the first time that David is saying that this is what he said. Carrying on in point 1 of Radak. Aval David amar ken bilibo ki mipnei zeh mina'anehu Hashem livnot habayit. Says the Radak, David himself reasoned based on what Natan said to him. Based on what Natan said to David, David understood on his own, with his own logic, that this was the reason that this is the reason that Hashem didn't want him to build the Beit HaMikdash. Point 2, which is slightly different, but along the same lines. Or Natan Hanavi amar lo ken. Natan came and told David this. The reason that he was unable to build the Beit HaMikdash was because he was this Ish Milchama. He'd spilt a lot of blood. Actually, it's not mentioned in Sefer Shmuel. It's not mentioned there. But now David is relating that this was an extra message that I received from the Navi. So the Radak is saying that actually, alongside the reasons given by Natan Hanavi, and we'll come back and analyze these in about 5 minutes' time, there was another reason that was given that isn't recorded and isn't written anywhere in Tanakh, either because it was never given explicitly, and David, on his own, with his own logic, understood and developed an understanding of precisely what that reason was that he couldn't build the Beit HaMikdash, or it was because actually Natan did give him that reason, just wasn't recorded in Tanakh. So that's what the Radak says. The Radak says that David had this reason, either from his own logic or that Natan gave it to him, but it just wasn't recorded in Shmuel. The Rabbah comes along with maybe a slightly different reason. And the Radak says as follows, Ki damim rabim shafachta artza lefanai. Yidmeh shelo haya ratzon Hashem yitbarach shivnehu David ligalot lefanav shadid licharev. Eventually, this Beit HaMikdash that someone was going to build, whether it was David, whether it was Shlomo, someone was going to build this first Beit HaMikdash. And yet, we knew, says Hashem, that even at this point in time, or says the Ralbag, Hashem knows that it's going to be destroyed. And he doesn't want there to be a case, carrying on the Ralbag, V'ulai yomru ki ba'avon David shaharag nefashot rabot me'agoyim asa Hashem yitbarach ken lebayit hazeh u'Yisrael. Hashem doesn't want people to turn around and say in a few hundred years, we know why that Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. It was destroyed because it was built on flawed ideas. It was built on a flawed understanding. Not a flawed understanding, but it was built by someone who was slightly flawed in what he'd done. Because he'd killed lots of people, eventually this Beit HaMikdash was doomed to disaster. So from the very start, it was built and we knew it was going to never last. And therefore, that's why it was destroyed. Says the Ralbag, that's why Hashem doesn't want the Beit HaMikdash to be built by David. Because David is this person who's killed lots of people, and there's a chance that in the future people will turn around and say, because David killed lots of people, that's why the Beit HaMikdash was flawed and it ends up being destroyed. Says Hashem, I don't want that being the answer. I don't want anybody saying that from the very outset it was destined to be destroyed, even though it might well have been destined to be destroyed. I don't like that, says Hashem. So Hashem says, I'm going to leave it for your son to build. Your son was never in a war. Your son has no battles or any wars or any conflicts during his lifetime. He will build the Beit HaMikdash so that nobody can ever claim when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed that it was destroyed because it was built on a flawed concept. No, they're going to have to look deeper inside the flaws of the Jewish people at the time to work out why it was destroyed. That's what the Ralbag says. And the Ralbag says that maybe that is what's going through David's mind when he says that he understands. He understands from the message he got from Natan that he's not to build it. And David comes up with this understanding that it's because he's a man of war and because he's spilt much blood, Hashem doesn't want him building it. That's the Ralbag. The Malbim, in the third and final answer, says something interesting, which is this. You need two conditions with which to build the Beit HaMikdash. That there's going to be a king. And then there will be rest from their enemies. This is the pasuk in Dvarim that deals with this. David thought that actually these two Tanaim had been fulfilled. These two conditions had been fulfilled. And actually, it was a flawed understanding. They hadn't been fulfilled. And David, at the very, very end, when he's relating this after the fact to his son and to the wider Jewish people, understands that even though he thought he could build the Beit HaMikdash, it wasn't right to build the Beit HaMikdash because that second condition, there was a king. David was the king. But the second condition, it'll be menucha, it'll be a peaceful time, had not yet been fulfilled. And that's why David turns around and says, based on what Natan says, I can look back and see that actually I was the Nishmel Chama. During my reign, it wasn't yet the menucha that had been promised to allow us to build the Beit HaMikdash. So we have three resolutions here that maybe try to start understanding why it was that David says one reason when Natan says another reason. Because David is looking at the reasons Natan gives and being more stark with exactly what he says. Natan comes along and says it's going to be your son that builds the Beit HaMikdash. As I said, we'll look back in a minute and analyze exactly what Natan says. And David looks at that, and whether it's the Radak, whether it's the Ralbag, whether it's the Malbim, comes up with his understanding that because he is an Ishmael Chama, whether that is because, whether that is that Natan told him it just wasn't recorded in Tanakh, whether it is the idea that the Beit HaMikdash was going to be destroyed, and David realizes that and understands now, I'm the Ishmael Chama, and I don't want the excuse being that because I was the Ishmael Chama, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Or whether it's the Malbim who comes along and says that David thought genuinely that it was time to build the Beit HaMikdash, but realized as time went on that he wasn't the right person, and that's why Natan said that it would be his son, because he himself was presiding over a reign that involved a lot of wars and a lot of bloodshed. Interestingly, though, all three of these Rishonim, and I think this really connects with our own understanding of this whole idea. All three Rishonim say that there's nothing inherently wrong with being in war. And I think that's the important thing that comes out of this, which is if we're going to say that David's reasoning alone was the reason for not building the Beit HaMikdash, we find ourselves in a tricky situation, which is that maybe war is not the ideal situation. Now, war is, of course, not the ideal situation. But when war is necessary, why should you yourself be prevented from doing something like building the Beit HaMikdash just because you fought a war? The war is necessary. The war is a war of mitzvah. It might be a chiyuv even to fight these wars. Why should it be that because you fought the wars, you can't build the Beit HaMikdash? So we have here maybe these understandings that there's not a flaw in and of itself with fighting the war. There's a issue that because the war is being fought, the correct surrounding conditions that are required can't be there. Whether that is like the Ralbag, because you're fighting a war, people will say in years to come when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, it's because you fought wars, the Beit HaMikdash already started on flawed foundations. Or whether it's the Malbim that says that you need two conditions, and war is simply not the condition that you can have. And therefore, there was no issue with David himself being involved in wars. It wasn't like we say, David was this Bidiavad type of king who fought wars. No, not at all. It was simply that the Beit HaMikdash and the building of it requires certain surrounding conditions that weren't met during the reign of David. Now, we don't have a long time to go, but I just want to really point here to the Radak, because the Radak, we won't read inside, but the Radak says something actually fascinating. And the Radak says, actually, there was something flawed with the wars that David fought. And there we have to really look at Sefer Shmuel. But we see in Sefer Shmuel that David was fighting many different wars. Some of the wars he was fighting, or some of the wars he was responsible for, were maybe not the most ideal wars being fought. And the Radak here quotes a few of these wars. For example, when David takes responsibility for the city of Nov being destroyed, which was the city of Kohanim, David takes responsibility and says, it's because of my actions that this city was destroyed. I should have realized that Shaul was going to wreak revenge, and therefore I shouldn't have put the city at risk. That's not an ideal war in any way whatsoever. There's also other wars that are going on. Okay, if we look at the second hand of Radak, אותם שלא היו בני מלחמתו, אפשר שהיו בהם אנשים טובים וחסידים. When I was fighting wars and really wreaking a lot of havoc, both inside the borders of Eretz Yisrael and also outside the borders of Eretz Yisrael, when David was fighting this proxy war with Shaul, maybe there were some of the people I killed there who actually were good and positive people, and I shouldn't have had to kill them. Now, it's true that I was trying to save the Jewish people. It's true that I was trying to bring about this idea of taking over from Shaul. But even so, this was not an ideal war. This was certainly not a Melchemet Mitzvah. And because of that, the Radak says the thought process of David might have been correct. That actually David, in and of himself, was maybe slightly flawed. It wasn't a lechatchila war that he was fighting. It was very much a b'diavad war. And because of that, David comes to the understanding that he was in Ishmael Chama. And damim shafachta, he did spill blood that didn't necessarily need to be spilled. And therefore, David takes ownership, it takes responsibility for the fact that the Beit HaMikdash couldn't be built in his reign, because actually, says David, you're right, there were wars that were fought. And yes, you know what? Fighting a war that needs to be fought, let's say, for example, against Amalek, may not have prevented me from building the Beit HaMikdash. That might have been absolutely fine. If I was fighting a war against the 7 nations inside Eretz Yisrael, that might also not have stopped me from building the Beit HaMikdash. But because I was fighting these battles, even if they may have been justified, they're not on the same level. And once you're not on that same level, you're going to be prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. But what I want to do in the final 5 minutes is go back to Natan. When Natan relates to David, or when Natan receives this nevuah from Hashem as to why David cannot build the Beit HaMikdash, Natan, if we look at the psukim very carefully, we can come up with many reasons, but I want to specifically look at 2 reasons that are given by Natan as to why David can't build the Beit HaMikdash. The first one we've alluded to, and the first one, sir, is as follows. We'll read the pasuk in English. I will establish a home for my people Israel, and I will plant them firm, so they shall dwell secure and shall tremble no more. Evil men shall not oppress them any more, as they did in the past. Now, that's Natan. And in David's reign, that never happened. In David's reign, David was fighting wars, fighting battles, whether it was with enemies, whether it was kind of against Shaul, whether it was against his son who took over, whether it was against his other son who took over. There were battles being fought the whole time. There was no safety or overall security for the Jewish people. What do we find, though, in Sefer Malachim Aleph, Perek Hey, in the reign of Shlomo Melech? Vayeshev Yehuda Yisrael Lavetach Ish Tachat Gafno V'Tachat Te'enato Midan V'Ad Be'eshava Kol Yemei Shlomo. In Shlomo's reign, there was safety. There was widespread security for the Jewish people. Everyone was safe and secure. If we go back to Natan, that's what's going on. Says Hashem, I need a reign that is completely secure, that the Jewish people are not worrying about battles. They can focus completely on building me a bait. That's what Hashem says. That's one of the reasons from Natan. Now, yes, that does clash slightly with David's reasoning, but that's a reason that Natan presents from to David al pi Hashem. There's a second reason though, and if we look carefully, we'll see as follows. Look what Natan says to David. This is in bold towards the end of source 3. ושכבת את אבותיך והקימותי את זרעך אחריך שיצא ממך והכינותי את ממלכתו. הוא יבנה בית לשמי וכוננתי את כיסא ממלכתו עד עולם. Says Hashem, and we read this carefully, says Hashem to Natan, I can't establish a Beit HaMikdash in the reign of David. Do you know why? Because David is the first in his line of kings. He's the first in his line. Shaul was the first in his line. And his son never took over. Jonathan never took over. And therefore that came and disappeared. David comes next. But David is still the first king in his lineage. I can't allow a house to be built for Hashem, for me, says Hashem, when this is still the first king in the lineage. I can only allow a house to be built to Hashem, or for me, says Hashem, when there is a next generation. When David is not the first king, but there's a king after him who follows in his lineage and continues on with this idea of Beit David. Says Hashem to Natan, that's what I'm telling you. David wants to build a bait for me. He can't build a bait. I need somebody to build a bait for Hashem only when that person is continuing the generations of kings. So Natan comes along and says to David, unfortunately, you can't build a Beit HaMikdash for a number of different reasons. So let's quickly summarize exactly what we've seen. We've seen that when David comes to the end of his life, he tells his son Shlomo, and he tells other people that the reason he couldn't build the Beit HaMikdash is because he spilt lots of this blood. But when we look at the actual reasons given in Sefer Shmuel, those aren't the reasons given. Natan gives David other reasons instead. So we explored together 3 possible reasons why David came up on his own with these 3 possibilities, or why David came up on his own with the reason that he was a man of war, even though that wasn't explicitly said. And then we also explored as well the exact reasons given by Natan. Then maybe David had different reasons, but if we look together at what Natan said, we see these 2 other reasons. One being that there needed to be a period of complete stability and peace, and that couldn't be provided by David. And the second reason was that there needed to be this continued lineage of kings, and the first king in his line wasn't able to build the Beit for Hashem because he needed stability, not in terms of the environment around the kingship, but the kingship itself needed to be stable. It needed to be shown and demonstrated that it wasn't just one king now, it was a line of kings. And that was another reason why David couldn't build the Beit HaMikdash. So we've explored this topic together, and I wish everyone Chag Shavuot Sameach, Chag Sameach, and look forward to sharing much more Torah over the coming years. And anybody following along live, it's not too late to donate and to give more to the campaign. And we thank you in advance for your generosity.